So for this video, I'm doing something a bit different. Rather than a short tutorial with a lot of cuts, this is a longer, more free-form video where I'm going to discuss not only how I do things, but a lot about why I do things. Mix this in with the lo-fi music, and I'm hoping this will be helpful to watch actively, but peaceful to watch passively as background noise as well. So today I'm doing the absolutely beautiful Questing Knight Banner Bearer. I'm starting out with the horse. I did an all-over coat of Rhinox hide, and I'm following up with this Doombull Brown. The second layer should cover most of the high areas of the horse, leaving the low lights in of that Rhinox hide. We'll also follow up with the wash. I have a more detailed guide on how I painted this horse in a different video, but for now we're just walking through the steps. So I actually learned this method of painting brown on a horse a long time ago, before contrast paints were even a thing. This is basically the default way I used to paint horses. I use a lot more contrast now. It gives a nice, healthy mid-brown, which I think is a really good default color for these destrier war horses that you're doing if you're doing Bretonnia, or even knights in the Empire. These big horses were usually, a dark brown or even a pure black. And for this banner bearer, I don't really want anything but the banner to stand out. Everything else I want to be, generic might not be the right word, but generic for a Bretonnian knight, if you know what I mean. This wash of Agrax Earthshade I'm doing right now has two purposes. One, it's really going to deepen our low lights. That will help the model, after we run a couple highlights. But this also blends the two colors we've used so far together. Using a wash to blend colors together is such an underrated attribute of these W washes. Once dry, I just followed up again with another layer of Doombull Brown. Now that we got the other two layers blended, we're just very careful to put this layer of Doombull Brown a little bit lighter than the last one, so it just increases the variety of tones we have here. We'll have the Doombull Brown, we'll have the wash Doombull Brown, then we'll have the wash Rhinox hide. These are just kind of the minor things you could do. It does add some time doing these extra layers, these smaller layers with some colors that are really close together, but they really go a long ways to making the model look good at the end step. The last thing I did here was just a final highlight of this Death Call Brown. Obviously this is a much different brown than the rest of the model, so I use it very sparingly. Around the hooves at the feet, hairs pop out a little bit more. Chose to keep this brown horse like really a pure brown, but if you wanted to make it pop a little bit more, you could also add socks here, or you could use a white or gray highlight in these final things to make the horse look like he's got a little bit of age to him. And just doing this color just a little bit more on the very, very highest points of the model, but being careful not to overuse it, because it is such a big jump from this color to the rest of the horse. It looks cartoonish if you use it too much. For the tail, the mane, I opted to just leave it very generic, a black. Because I already had the spray paint in black, I just started taking lighter colors and dry brushing them on, just a little bit lighter each area, starting with this Corvus black, and then some Eshin gray, and finally Dawnstone. Just a real easy way to do these tails that end up looking really good in the end. And with the flesh parts of the horse taken care of, we can move on to doing the comparison. Again, because this is a banner bearer and I want the focus to really be on the banner, I really opted for a pretty generic scheme for the Knight's Heraldry. In this case, I went straight for what I consider the default colors, for the GW scheme for Bretonnia, which would be Corone, the old colors of Lewin Leoncoeur, blue and red. In this case, we're starting with a Macragge blue. the release of the own world. I guess the default colors are now black and red, the GW Brion color scheme, but creature of habit, what can I say? In this case, I decided to alternate. We'll do the front blue on one side, the back blue on the other. The other sides will fill in the red, and then maybe on these we'll do some kind of pattern so it's not totally generic. For a rough idea of what I'm going for, you can look at one of the covers to the old GW Bretonnian novels with Collard. It's a pretty similar scheme to him. So the shields I'm avoiding, and to be honest, this is because at this point when I was painting, I haven't decided what I want to do with the shields yet. I was kind of hoping I would get started, and about halfway through the model, inspiration would strike and it all kind of fit together. Which, to be honest, I do a lot with my knights, and for the most part it tends to work out. Red color I'm using for an undercoat here is Mephiston Red, also by GW. This is one of their better paints. It gives a nice rich red, and it covers well. You can get maybe not everything, but most things within one coat, and definitely everything by 2 coats. And the combination of this red and blue are just nice, bright, default colors for what we think of when we think of, a medieval period when everything was bright and colorful. Even though in modern movies everything's painted out to be so dull and grim and basically grayscale. Just trying to be a little careful here on the border, trying to get a nice straight line down the neck of the horse where the colors meet. The back end's really easy, the leather covers it up, so you really just have to focus on getting the front and the neck of the horse right. I decided to do the comparison around the face in actual white rather than doing either the red or the blue. Ultimately, the reason I am doing this is I think I want to get some kind of pattern on this comparison, probably using water slides of some symbol, maybe a fleur-de-lis, but that area around his head is hard to do, so I want to break that up from the rest of the comparison so it's not weird for it not to have the same pattern. I'm just taking a lot of care here not to get paint where I don't want it to be, because I already have that flesh finished. If I get a little white on it, it really sucks to have to go back and repair it. Pro tip, if you're quick and you mess up, if you have a wet paper towel near you, you might be able to wipe off the fresh coat of acrylics off what you already did, and so you don't have to cover it with paint. If you're fast enough, you can just wipe it off. So next, I just took some lead belcher and did the metal parts of the horse, the hoofs of the feet, and the chainmail under the comparison. Lead belcher is a real safe metallic color. Like, it's not super bright, but it's not super dull. I feel like it could work for just about any kind of metal, which is why I use it here in this model. I'm still not sure how I want it to look when it's fully finished, so I don't know if I'm looking at, dark metals or light metals would look better, so I'm just using something in the middle ground. And lead belcher is about as safe as you get as far as guns and metallics if you're on a limited budget, and you just have like 1 silver in your arsenal, or 1 or 2. Lead belcher definitely should be one of them. I also really like 2 thin coats. If you see my videos, you probably see me use them a lot. Their metallic paint does tend to separate easily, however, so unless you have one of those little electric mixers that, shakes your bottles for you, I'd probably recommend sticking with GW or maybe even Vallejo if you don't want to pay GW prices. So I've been very open with the fact that I really don't have this horse all that planned out. However, at this point, I'm really liking how it's coming together. I think the brown looks very nice. I do a tutorial video on how I do this brown for horses with traditional GW paints. But especially now that their hooves are being painted, the horseshoes, I really think the flesh of this horse is really coming together. At this point, I really have to decide on how I'm doing my shields before I get much further on this horse. Ultimately, because I wanted to keep this fairly simple, fairly generic, so the focus is on the banner, I decided to do, a very classic 4-panel shield, what goes, blue, red, red, blue, alternating. I think it should look pretty okay. And I'm starting with the blue I used earlier, this McCrag blue. When you're doing stuff like this, it's really important to think about which colors should be in the background, which one should be in the foreground. You definitely want your lighter colors to be lower because they're harder to cover with. If you're doing black and yellow, it is much easier to go black on yellow than it is yellow on black, right? And for this blue and red, it's not that much of a difference, and it's close enough that some people might feel differently, but I feel like it's easier to cover the blue with the red than it is to cover the red with the blue. And so I'm doing a nice base coat of this McCrag blue, being very careful not to get it on the red comparison. As you see, even the black here doesn't cover super well, so you definitely got to get a couple layers, but just take your time and it comes out pretty good on the other side. Now I'm just going to do the entire comparison in this known oil. It's going to make it look very dirty. You definitely can't leave this as your last layer. By doing an all over coat of this known oil on this black, or excuse me, on this blue and on this red, you're virtually guaranteeing you have to do at least one more coat of your base color. But if you're very careful with your next coat, it does look pretty good. It does add proper depth. And ultimately it will make your model look a little dirtier than if you just did, known oil in very specific places. As you can clearly tell, my end result on this is very blotchy. I wasn't being very careful, but this is because I knew there was another layer coming on that's going to clean all of this up. While that dries, I decided I'm going to do contrast paints for the leather on this horse, which means I gotta get away from this black, which means a quick layer of this GW Wraithbone. So I can, once it dries, go over it with contrast. If I planned this horse out to the extent I do for most of my videos and decided I was going to use contrast paints for the barding, I probably would have done a gray sear base coat rather than black, but you live and learn. Now that we have that taken care of, I'm going to go back with my base red, my Mephiston red, and paint over all these raised areas, leaving only the darkest parts, the lowest points of the comparison with the known oil cover. As you can see, at least when it's wet, there's quite a bit of color difference here. When it dries, that color difference does fade. Mephiston red does dry a little bit darker, but you should still be able to see pretty easily where I am absolutely leaving a little bit of that darker red with the known oil covering beneath it, right against the shield I want it, right against the leather I want it, in the biggest recesses in the fold of his cloak. But other than that, we push it back up to that Mephiston red. And now we do the same with this McCrag blue. We're going to clean up all those splotches anywhere where it's high and flat to where it shouldn't be that dark, just leaving the known oil shaded blue in the biggest recesses of the comparison. as you can hopefully see here, even though the darker blue, the darker red's only in the smaller parts of the comparison, the little bit of extra shading just enhances the overall look so much. It makes the small model look much more 3D. So here I am basically furthering work on the heraldry on the shield using this painter's tape as a guideline, so I get nice straight lines. The horizontal line, I just freehanded it. Obviously you're running a risk there, but especially with these red and blues, it's pretty easy to cover up if you need to. So don't be afraid to freehand if you're using these colors and making a mistake. You can probably clean it up later. Once I was happy with the heraldry, I set it down and let it dry, and then I moved on to some Agaros dunes. This is one of the contrast paints from GW that can work as a leather. This is a really light leather. It's not a color I use a lot for leather, preferring more the look of a snakebite leather or maybe even a skeleton horde. But for this horse, with the darker blues and the reds, I just thought it'd look kind of nice, especially with the green and the banner that will be coming up later in the video. And for these smaller pieces of leather near his head, I'm using a smaller brush and I'm being very careful, again, just so I don't have to go through cleanup of the layers of paint I'm already really happy with. Considering how little of the saddle is actually seen once a knight is mounted, this probably doesn't mean much, but I like to do my saddle in a different color than I've done the rest of the leather, just to get a little bit of contrast, make it stand out a little bit more. It kind of gives the illusion that they're separate, that a knight could put a different saddle on the horse, you know what I mean? So I don't know, maybe it's just a personal thing, but that's just kind of something that I prefer to do. At this point, I started work on the rest of the metallics of the horse, the shields, on the leather, the barding. I didn't do these before because, again, I'm very much winging this horse. Sometimes I do those in the heraldry colors. In this case, it'd be like the blue and the red. Sometimes just one of the heraldry colors. Sometimes I even use like a minor third color. Like in this case, I might do a white. But just looking at the horse, it just kind of suit me that these be metallic, a pure metal. And I wanted it to be shinier and lighter than what I did the rest of the horse metal. So I went with this 2-coat silver from 2 Thin Coats as my basic base. And the armor on the head of the horse, I am using this exact same color, just so there's a little bit of consistency that might help tie everything together. On a whim, I decided to do the leather on, I really don't know what this thing is, the leather barding around his neck, whatever the official name is. It has 2 shields on the side. I decided to do these in gold rather than the silver I use for the rest of the horse, just to break things up a little bit. I'm also going to go ahead and do the fleur-de-lis and the markings on the top of his face armor in the same color for the same reason. I'm just going to start out with a base color of Balthazar Gold, which is a really nice dark old gold color. And then if I don't like that, I'll use lighter, brighter metallics to brighten up a little bit. So next I'm doing highlights, and to be honest, this is where a horse model can really start to be a slog to get through. I'm mostly excited to paint the knights and to get the whole thing together and cohesive, but this is the point of the horse where you're almost done, but you still have so much to do. It takes so much more time than it does in your head, and it can be a little bit frustrating. But here I am just trying to power through. I'm using this Techless blue, which is quite a bit lighter than the blue I used, the Macragge blue, so I'm just being very careful to only apply a nice, thin, even highlight. I am doing this in a relatively classic way to highlight a model. Anywhere there's a raise point on this comparison, all along the edges, and the edges around the heraldry shield, I'm going to do a highlight of this Techless blue. For a paint color named after an elf, it's actually quite a nice color. I use it a lot for highlights. I don't use it a lot as a base coat because its ability to cover is pretty lackluster. It looks really good on top of blue. It's kind of a frustrating experience to put it on top of any other color. So for me personally, it's more of a highlight than anything else, but it is a nice color blue. And if you have the patience to do a full comparison in this blue, it could look really cool. For my red highlight, I'm using this Wild Rider red and doing what is essentially the same process I did with the Techless blue. I want to use a nice thin highlight. The color is quite a bit brighter, so I don't want a large transition area. I think it looks pretty bad. If you have a big jump in colors, there should be a thin, sharp line. I'm doing the top of the heraldry shields, anywhere there's a sharp corner and anywhere there's a raised edge. I like the silver metallics I used on this horse. I'm using this mithril silver from Two Thin Coats. This is just one paint shade higher than the one I used for the base coat. And there's not much to say besides that, just a very standard highlight here. Just hitting along the edges and any raised area like the hook that keeps the metal shields onto the leather. For this gold highlight, I'm using this Retributor armor, which should, against the Balthazar gold, pop quite a bit, and so I gotta be a little careful to do this sparingly. So I gotta be very careful here and keep the highlights thin, since there's such a difference between the Retributor armor gold and the Balthazar gold. But if I play right and I get the highlights right, this bright gold on this old gold should make it look like the fleur-de-lis and other parts of gold on this model are really shimmering in the sunlight. So the next thing I did was add a pattern to the comparison. This is a pretty long and tedious step. I do not consider myself skilled enough to do these freehand. Some people do, and they do it fantastically. I just do not have that kind of brush control. So when I do a pattern on a horse comparison, I'm mostly stuck to using either pins or, in this case, water slide decals. I'm sure anyone who's watched this video is well aware of what water slide decals are. GW usually comes with a few of them, or I should say at least old GW did. But there's also a lot of third-party vendors, either through Etsy or eBay, that you can find very easily. In this case, I'm using one of those. They sold me a whole sheet of these small fleur-de-lis, and I am just cutting them out and placing them, hopefully evenly, up the blue on this comparison. This is a tedious process. When you get to things like the edges of the leather or the shield heraldry, like, you have to cut out the water slide decal to fit it. So it does take some time. It's not a fast process by any means, but I do think the end result looks pretty good. And if you do it right, all the water slide decals look even, and you really can't tell that they aren't painted on, as long as you get it to lay down correctly. But because there's so many of them and you're putting water slides right next to water slides, that's really not easy to do. So if you do this, I do recommend using micro sol and micro set. Just water is not going to give you a good result. These products also keep things very pliable while you move them around, while you make sure everything lines up where you want it to line up. So you have plenty of time between putting these chemicals on and when the sticker really gets dried and set in its ways for you to manipulate it around and make sure it fits exactly where you want to fit. In this case, I'm just making sure I'm trying to get these up as straight as possible, only curving, you know, where the comparison curves, try to get an even gap between them, and ultimately just trying to make it look like a pattern on this cloth. This is definitely a slow process, so it pays to help to have a nice TV show to watch while you're doing this. If you have that capability in your painting room. Here I'm only able to do just one little stick at a time because I have room for basically one row, and the rest of them are going to have to be cut individually, which is, yeah, I'm not going to lie to you, I know I said it before, but it's a very tedious process. Things definitely get a little tedious here near the end when you're going near the head, just because almost all of these details can only be applied one at a time and custom cut. I will say you don't have to be perfect on this. The model is small enough. As long as you generally get it correctly, it's gonna look correct unless someone gets really close to the model, which happens rarely. I promise if you just get this mostly correct, you're going to get so many nice compliments on these horses when you put them on the tabletop. You might have to put a few different coats of microset on this. This is just going to help the paper from the decal basically blend into the paint and kind of mold and stick to the contours of the horse. Don't be afraid to do 3-4 coats if you have to. And now that the horse is done, we'll move on to the rest of the model. So next I started work on the banner, and it was really important for me that this stand out. So I wanted this banner to look like it was something that's been passed down from questing knights. So some of the requirements is I didn't want it to be the same colors as the comparison on the horse, because I didn't want to make it look like it goes together, but rather this was just a knight that was honored enough to be able to lift this banner. Because this banner was being associated with these questing knights, which are associated with seeking out the Grail and the Green Knight, I decided to go green with the banner. The base here is a very dark Caliban green, but I plan to lighten this up through other layers. I very purposefully don't use a lot of green on my knights, whether they be questing, Grail, Errant, or Knight of the Realm. This is because green is very much associated with their religion, with the, Lady of the Lake and the Green Knight. I try to reserve the color for those kind of things. And so the effect is that it really ends up popping when I do use green and draws the eye. As you can probably see, right now I'm working on the swords that are stabbed through the back of this banner. I'm doing my very basic process, which is I start with a darker metallic, in this case it's plate mail from Two Thin Coats. I get a coat of that on. I then coat the entire miniature with a thin layer of this Griff Charger Gray contrast paint. This adds my shadow. Then I take the next color up for metallics, in this case with Two Thin Coats, it's Surcoat's Silver. I water it down quite a bit, so it's almost not quite like a wash, but close. And then I do one side of the sword where it reflects more light, leaving the other side covered with the contrast paint. Then I finish it up with a highlight of the metallic paint that's the next, lighter color, which in this case will be Mithril Silver, also from Two Thin Coats. This is a very easy way to make it look like your swords are reflecting light. Obviously it's kind of hard, there's just a little bit of sword visible in this banner, but if you watch some of my other videos, I do the same thing with lance tips and other swords of models I painted. Next I started working on the base coats for other objects in this banner. Obviously there's a lot of detail here, and so a lot of different colors and processes to go through. Get the feel of this banner right, where I wanted it to be a sacred relic, something that's passed down. I wanted to make sure the parchment had different ages on it, like they were added for different times over decades and crusades and battles. So I decided to use a few different techniques for doing the scrolls. All of them should look very aged in the end. They should all be slightly different in warmth versus coolness and general color, and so they look like they are different types of paper or added at different times. For these large scrolls, I'm doing a base of Rakarth Flesh, and then some Seraphim Sepia, and then some highlighting. But for other scrolls in the front, I might be using different colors. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because it's not really the point of this video, but I do have another video where I go over each of the techniques I use for these scrolls individually. Agaros Dunes for the leather here on the front and back. These strips of leather are so narrow that just one layer of contrast gives a good color to it, because by its nature, the contrast paint is going to have some variation to it, making it look more realistic as leather, and so you can get a really nice outcome for very little work. The leather-bound book on top of the model I want to do different, however. In this case, I'm using a base coat of Mournfang Brown, and then I'm going to wash it with gnome oil. I'm going to let that wash dry for a little bit and do some other base coats for the background stuff, so lead belcher for some metal pieces. But eventually I'm going to go back to that book, and with a dry brush I'm going to dry on a lighter shade of brown and then a really bright shade of brown very lightly to make the weather look very worn and very old. So the first heavy dry brush right here is going to be this Still Legion Drab, and I'm going to put this on very heavy. I want it to cover most of the leather, scratch it up a little bit, but obviously leave those lower tones shining through. And then a follow-up layer with this Deathclaw Brown. This is going to be the very lightest color I'm using, and so I don't want this to be as strong. I want it to be very light, and so definitely get your brush very dry for this. And hopefully once that's dry, it blends together pretty well. But in the meantime, I'm going to follow up on these other metal bits with a lighter color for the edge highlighting. And then I'm going to move on to painting more of the cloth of the banner. The cloth on this banner is going to be so important to pull the whole thing together and make this model stand out like I want it to do. This metal sculpt that I'm working with has these very large waves and bends within the cloth on this, so getting the transitions right will be crucial. I'm starting with a 50-50 blend of Caliban Green and Wog Flesh, and this is going to help set the base for the mid-tone. I don't want it in the very deepest recesses of these cloths, but I do want it everywhere else, and this is just going to be basically a transition color as we go from the darkest colors to the light. I want it to be a nice smooth transition like you're actually seeing it wave in the wind. But because these models are so small, that's never naturally going to happen, so you have to trick the eye with layers of colors and slight variation. Then at the very peaks of these folds, I want to do the pure Wog Flesh, so then I have basically three colors there. I have the Caliban Green, and then it's going to transition to the 50-50 mix of Wog Flesh and Caliban Green, and at the very top, pure Wog Flesh. For the edge highlight, I'm using Moot Green here. This color is quite a bit brighter than the rest. It's a very sharp contrast between the darkness of the Caliban Green and then this very last highlight, which helps the edges pop really well, but it means you have to be very careful with how much you apply. If I did very thick lines of the sharp contrast, it looked very cartoony, and it's just not the look I'm going for. So when I use a sharp highlight for this, I use a small brush, and I am very, very careful to keep these edge highlights small. And next, I'm just going to pick out a couple areas for gold, some trinkets on the back of the fleur-de-lis, the binding on the book, just to help make this banner stand out as very special and sacred. And then I'm going to flip this around and basically repeat all these steps for the front. So a lot of what I did for the back I'm also doing to the front, and for the same reason, so I'm going to end up skipping over a lot of this for the video. I will cover the scrolls briefly here and there, but I have a whole video dedicated to that if you want a more detailed step-by-step process and how to do these scrolls. So for the book pages, I'm using a base coat of Zandai dust. If you remember right, for the scrolls, I did a base coat of Ricard flesh. And this is going to help those scrolls and the book look like they came from different times and they were put together later, that they've aged differently or more so. Follow up on that, I'm using the Seraphim Sepia. This is going to be my wash that I'm doing on both the book pages and for the scrolls up here to add a worn look to them. I use this wash for so many things. It's a really good product to have, but I really like it on the scrolls here for adding that worn, aged look to any kind of paper. Using roughly the same method of how I blended together different greens for the waves of the cloth of the banner, I'm doing the same thing for the scroll, starting with the 50-50 mix of my Ricard flesh and Upsapti bone. Don't be afraid to cover pretty wide with this, but just make sure you leave the original color in the depths and recesses of the scroll. Ultimately, this is going to help imitate a shadowing effect that would occur if it was a life-size scroll. And just like we did with the cloth of the banner, we're going to follow it up with a pure Ushabti bone. And so these three colors should blend together very nicely. You'll have the Ricard flesh with the sepia, and then it's going to blend into about a 50-50, and then it's going to blend into the pure at the highest points. The various shields that decorate the front of this banner I decided to do in the same colors as the horse. This is because I still view this red and this blue as the very generic Bretonnia color. Even though the old world has moved to a red and black, I still think of the 5th edition, 6th edition Corone colors. Also, this is just a nice, easy way to tie this banner back into the knight and the horse he's riding. While I didn't want the banner colors to be too fully like the knight, so it looks like it's just his banner, I think it's a nice touch to have small bits related back to the knight to show that he is at least bearing the banner currently. Now I'm adding some gold to some of the trinkets on the front of this banner, and I'm really starting to see this come together at this point. We just have the tops of the swords, the fleur-de-lis in the middle, and a few other banners to paint in a different way. The crux of how well this banner is going to turn out comes back to the fleur-de-lis in the middle. It's really going to catch the eye, so getting the light reflection on that is critical to take this paint job from an okay paint job to a good paint job. At the last minute, I changed my mind and decided to do this fleur-de-lis as gold instead of the original planned white. And this was mostly because I think I'll have an easier time showing the ripples inside this fleur-de-lis using a metallic paint. So I'm starting here with Balthazar gold, the same gold I've used in the rest of this project, which A, will help things tie in nicely, but B, it's a nice dark gold color to get as my base, and I can slowly bring up to show the really cool light reflection on these ripples. For the smaller fleur-de-lis on this banner, I've opted to use Iron Hand Steel as a base coat. This will make the gold one, the large gold one in the center, stand out more. And I'm using this particular color of silver because it is brighter than the metallics I've used for the rest of the silver bits. And it'll hopefully make these look like more precious metal than, say, the chain or other various metal bits. Back to working on the gold here, I've opted to wash it with this Agrex Earthshade. This is just a nice brown wash that goes with gold really well, and it's going to help me get these low lights that will make the highlights we add later shine even brighter. And I'm doing this both for the emblem on top and the large fleur-de-lis in the middle of the banner. Because this fleur-de-lis is going to be the stopping point for the eye when you look at this model, it's really important that the highlights pop, and the easiest way to do that is to make sure your low lights are really low, and this wash really helps. Nuln oil is also an okay wash to use for this. I just think the brown looks more naturalistic than a Nuln oil would. I've decided to do the handles of these swords in 2 different colors. I think that kind of just lends to the idea that this banner has been added to over the years. And so for one, I'm doing a very lazy leather using Scrag Brown and several coats of Seraphim Sepia, and the other one I'm doing red. In this case, corn red, so it doesn't directly match the heraldry on the shield. Shading the chains and the tip of the swords here with Nuln oil, just add a little bit of depth to them so it looks more 3D to the naked eye. While that dries, I go back to the gold and I'm taking this Retributor armor, and I'm going to do the next layer of highlights for this gold, starting with the emblem on top, and then of course the golden fleur-de-lis in the middle. I'm not doing an edge highlight here per se. I'm getting a pretty wide area, anywhere that's not in the shadow, in the depths. Basically any raised flat surfaces, I want to be this color to make the whole thing brighter. When it comes to the golden fleur-de-lis here in the middle, basically same concept as I showed in the scrolls and in the cloth of this banner. Anywhere where there's a raised ripple, I want to go over with this higher, brighter gold color, leaving the original Balthasar gold in the depths. Next, I'm using Glorious Gold from Vallejo, and I'm doing an edge highlight here, but this is not going to be the final highlight on this gold, so I want it to not be very fine. I want it to be fairly thick, so we have room to go over with one more color transition. Use your best judgment, apply this paint where you think light would reflect, and definitely make sure you leave room for the depths. So when you pull back from this and you look at it from far away, you have a simulation of depth of shadow. For the final highlight on this banner for the gold parts, I'm actually using Rune Fang Steel from GW. Obviously, this is quite a bit different than the other gold colors you've used, so I really just want to do a very fine highlight here on the very edges of this fleur-de-lis, the very highest point. This will give the illusion of the very center point where light is reflecting. It almost will look like this is where it's so bright it's hard to look at. It only works if it's a very fine highlight though, so I want to use a small brush and being very careful not to apply too much pressure, so we just get a very fine line where we put the brush. On all the gold bits, I'm doing very lightly the edges, and then of course a little bit stronger the very highest points. For example, the very middle of this fleur-de-lis emblem on top of the banner. This Rune Fang can also be used as a highlight for the silver fleur-de-lis I did on this banner. For the more dull chains and ends of the swords, I'm using a highlight of this Iron Hand Steel, which was the base coat of, some of the other silver we did, but because we want this duller, this is the very highlight. And I'm just going to get the very standout bits from the ends of these swords, and then of course the high bits of the chains, so it has a nice 3D effect. Now this is really coming along. I'm going back to do the scrolls that I've ignored earlier, and this time I'm using yet another method, starting with the Morghast bone as a base. Using this color as a base will make a more yellowed paper. Perhaps it looks like it's been in the sun too long, but more importantly, it's still going to be a relatively realistic scroll color, and it'll look slightly different than the other scrolls I've done. And for the very last scroll, I'm going to do in contrast paint, so I want to make sure it has a nice even coat of Wraithbone before I start. Then I did a wash over the Morghast bone scrolls, and for this third one, I want a watered down skeleton horde to get a nice decayed parchment look. And then I'm going to finish that scroll off with a highlight of Screaming Skull. Definitely getting close to the end here. Now I want to do the writing on the parchment. A lot of people do no text on this, they just leave it to the imagination. I think that's mostly out of fear of ruining the paint job, but if you invest in some of these micro pens, anyone can make really nice scribbles along the parchments for the Warhammer miniatures. So you should be able to see on the tape on my hobby map below me where I practiced this a few times, but the trick to doing nice scribbles is making sure you switch up how each line looks. Each line should not be the same. You also want to dip down a little bit so it looks like, you know, you have the occasional P or Y color in or letter in there, excuse me. And if you get really fancy to imitate medieval text, you could do the first letter in your parchment very large and fancy so it stands out, and then the rest is scribbles. Or even, you know, occasionally put an image of the Grail or fleur-de-lis. These pins are small and you have really great control over them, so the sky's really the limit. One thing I very consciously did with this model is I didn't want the text to go all the way to the bottom of the scroll. In my head, these large scrolls are basically a record of the deeds for the questing knights who flew under this banner, and I wanted to leave room for more deeds to be added to it. This banner has an insane amount of detail on it, but I really love how it looks when I'm finished, and now I just need to make sure it has a knight worthy of holding it. I always save the knights for last because I find them to be by far the most enjoyable thing to paint, and you know, the thing that excites me most. In this case, I am starting with a good bright color for my metallics here. I want the knight's armor to really shine on this one. In my head, if you're worthy enough to bear this banner, like, you must be very special yourself. So I was really going for, you know, your very classic knight in shiny armor kind of thing. This knight is very detailed. I do believe the Perry brothers sculpted this, and all their sculpts are phenomenal, but the questing knights in particular just have a lot of details to them, but not to a point where they feel overwhelming or too much like some of the modern GW Age of Sigmar sculpts do. But overall, I absolutely adore this model. He's also blind, if you could tell so far. He has a cloth over his eyes, which I really think kind of adds to, you know, the lighter touch magic of the setting, to where this man can be blind, but somehow he is still serving the lady in this capacity. Apparently the mini scrolls on the banner of this model were not quite enough, but he also had to record his heroic deeds or questing promises on his own body as well. And we're going to start here with a nice base coat of Wraithbone. If If you are painting this model yourself, you'll notice that the parchment is quite thick. I think this is just a side effect of being metal, but make sure you get the paint into the sides and recesses so you don't get any weird gray spots later. For the base coat of his cloth, his clothes, I'm using this Trooper White from Too Thin Coats. This is by far my favorite white to work with, and it lends itself to a nice bright base for white clothes. I've opted to white rather than the red and blue because A, we have the red and blue shields on the banner already, so I feel like the knight is tied in. And plus, if you remember, we're using white as a minor color on the horse, and so I thought using the white as a major color on the knight itself would look pretty good. Plus, because this knight is blind and has been picked up as special enough or adequate enough to, fly this banner, I feel like white is a good color choice for him, and white feels special, almost like a paladin. Or who knows, maybe I'm just telling myself that because in my head I am sick of painting red and blue at this point. For the leather bits on this knight, which is mostly the stirrups and maybe his belt, I'm just using snakebite leather for a very standard leather effect. I'm painting the bracers on his forearms leather as well, but I don't want it to match the rest of the leather on the model, and I want it to be a variant, so I'm using this Agaros Dunes instead of the snakebite leather. His large necklace is clearly held by a chain, but I didn't want it to match the rest of his armor, which I've already done so bright. So you could do gold here, but I've opted to make the actual ornaments on the jewelry gold, and I don't like doing gold on gold, so I just went with a deeper, darker silver metallic and lead belcher for this necklace. Back to this Balthasar gold for the ornament on this necklace, and I'm doing this the same way as I did the gold on the banner itself. So for the decorative ends of this knight's chainmail, I've opted to do the shields in this gold like we did the ornament on top of the Agaros Dunes leather. And just like before, we do another layer of Retributor armor, leaving some gaps of the original color behind. Anytime I deal with any kind of chainmail, I always do a wash of known oil after the base coat to help enhance the depth. I know I said this before, but in case you skipped ahead in the video, the shading here will help add a fake shadow effect to these very small and shallow chain links. I'm also going to go ahead and shade the rest of his armor while I'm at it. So I think the knight and the banner on this model are really good, but the squire behind the knight is not up to the same level in my opinion. The face in particular of the model that's on this guy's shoulders seems to lack the detail and the care that went into the rest of the model. For these reasons, I've opted to make the knight more of a focal point than the squire, and to do this I am giving him a fairly light color skin and blonde hair. So that's what this Rackard flesh is right here. That's just my base layer on his flesh. And when I do the squire, I'll give him a darker skin and black hair and kind of have him blend in a little bit more than the knight. Now I'm going to use this Pallid Witch Flesh paint from GW to do highlights on the Rackard flesh, hitting the high points in his cheeks, chin, etc. Next I'm going to hit the flesh with this Reichland Flesh shade. So the goal here is twofold. It's going to help blend the Pallid Witch Flesh and the Rackard flesh together. At the same time, it's going to add some warmth and more pinkish human color to the hue of his skin. I'm just being very careful not to let it pull too much anywhere in his face. And while that dries, it's back to Trooper White to do the bandage over his eye. I thought at one point I'd do this kind of bloody, but when I got to thinking about it, it shouldn't be a fresh wound because he's still riding the horse, he's holding the banner. This is obviously something that he has already adapted to. So I decided to do the cloth in a way that was clean and looks like it's just something he wears every day. When doing the hair on this guy, I'm going to start with a Zendai Dust. For this guy, I'm going to ultimately give him blonde hair. I love Zendai Dust as a base for this. This method I'm using is a slightly modified version of the one Duncan Rhodes did for Games Workshop a long time ago when he still worked for them. This is going to give a more realistic blonde rather than the golden cartoony blonde you see on a lot of models. Once that is done, I'm going to follow up with a highlight of the Ushabti bone, picking out high points in the hair, individual strands that stick out, anywhere that could be differentiated from the blob of hair. I want to put this Ushabti hair highlight on. This includes the mustache and the chin goatee. Here where the hair bends around his head, I also want to get highlighted, so I'm just doing just a lot of little small downstrokes across his scalp, and this is where the blonde would reflect more light. So here's where things get really modified. Rather than a normal wash that Duncan Rose used, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of this contrast medium and skeleton horde, and I'm going to apply it thinly and evenly all over his hair. This of course will create the lowlights in the hair, create a brown undertone, and help blend our base color and our highlight color together to a more natural look. Just be careful to apply this evenly and incredibly thinly. You don't want too much of your brush at once. You don't want to overpower what's there with a thick blob of the skeleton horde. You want to thin it out and apply it very lightly all across the hair. For the final hair highlight, I am back to this Pallid Witch Flesh, this almost white color, and I'm just picking out very small individual strands and highlights in the hair, just use this very sparingly to just add a little bit of depth, a little bit of entrance. But if you use this everywhere, it's just not going to look natural, so just be very selecting for where you put this and be very careful not to put too much on at once. Real thin highlights here. Moving on, I shaded the cloth of this knight with Soul Blight Gray. The Apothecary White contrast paint works as well. I think these two paints are very similar. I don't notice much difference between them. But the point is, going over the cloth with those colors adds a little bit of depth. And then back with the Trooper White, I'm just picking out raised areas to raise back up again to increase the contrast between the high points and the low points so it looks more realistic. And then I added some scribbles for text along the parchment pinned to his shoulder in the same fashion that I did the banner. These micro pins really come in handy for that. The only thing you gotta look out for is be very careful putting like a wash over these because you don't want the ink to run. So basically once you use this micro pin, you need to seal it with your clear coat before you do anything else with that part of the model. If you do anything else, I usually do this as a last step. Next, I took this Rune Fang Steel and did the edge highlighting for all silver metallics on this particular knight. Nothing particularly fancy here, just a nice even highlight all over the edges of the chain link and then the plate armor on his legs. I will also do the highest points on the neck ornament, the gold one, in this color as well, so it looks like it's really reflecting light. But this pretty much wraps up work on the knight, and now I can focus on finishing the shield and the Squire. The Squire has a lot of fine details and it's hard to kind of figure out where to start, but just to get started, I'm gonna grab this Yanden yellow contrast, which is a color I absolutely adore, and do some of the baggages around the Squire's feet. And just like any time using contrast paints, I'm being very careful to leave an even coat everywhere and not let it pool in places I don't want it to pool, so I don't get left with ugly coffee stains. I don't want the Squire to stand out that much, so I'm using a lot of browns. You notice I already have a brown base coat on his sword, his pants, and his boots. I'm just touching up a little bit more here of this Mornfang brown. Not dull colors per se, but I mean, I guess that is fair to say I'm using kind of dull colors here. I don't want the Squire to stand out next to the knight. And then I follow up on that with a highlight of Scrag Brown, just picking out the highlights of his pants, his boots, just to add depth to the model. For the shirt on the Squire, I'm going with a Steel Legion drab. This is a nice brown dull color, but it's a different brown than I used for the feet, so you do get a pleasing amount of contrast there. Now, I said this before, but the main reason I am using so many drab colors on the Squire is I don't think this part of the model is as well sculpted as the rest, so I don't want it to stand out. But also at the same time, I like the idea that this knight, who has earned so much through his deeds, is wearing these bright colors, and the Squire, who is just a boy and hasn't earned anything, is not wearing the colors of his heraldry and is wearing these dull colors until he earns his stripes, basically. I am going to shade that shirt with some Agrex Earth Shade. It's just an easy way for me to add depth here. And then I move on to the telescope. I don't want it to be a silver or a gold, but I do think it should be metallic, so I'm really kind of left with bronze colors here. I'm starting with this Hassut Copper, which is really more of a highlight color, but I think it's going to work here. It's going to give a nice shiny bronze slash copper slash whatever base for this telescope. Next, I moved on to his skin tone. I don't want him to be the same skin tone as the knight, and I do want him to be darker and a little bit more drab. So I'm just starting out with a nice basic base coat of Cadian flesh. And while that dries, I'm going to pick out any remaining leather on this little Squire with Agros Dunes. Because these straps are so narrow, contrast paint works great for these, and you can get a really good effect basically with one coat. I am going to further do the flesh with this Raglan Flesh Shade. To be honest here, I think you see me make a mistake. I am applying this a little too thickly, so it's going to leave recesses thicker than I would have liked to see. It's still passable, the model's still fine, but my suggestion to you, if you were following along with this, would be to maybe cut down this flesh shade about 50-50 with contrast medium, or at the very least not have so much on your brush. But this is going to give him a nice solid olive-ish skin tone that will look quite different than the knight himself. For the helmet on the model's back, I'm doing it the same way I did the rest of the armor on the knight, so it should match with it, starting with this base color of Iron Hand Steel. And we'll go ahead and do the edge of his sword sheath in this color as well. To highlight the shirt on the Squire, I am just going to use this Bane Blade Brown. Because the Squire is so small, I really only think the one highlight is necessary rather than doing a blend. You're just not going to be able to see it anyway, so this one highlight on the Squire is probably good enough. As you can probably tell from the recording, I have started the shield as well. In the background there is a thin coat of Wraithbone on the back of my shield. I'm not going to get in the shield a lot in this video, but I do have a whole video dedicated to shield painting if you're interested in that. Now I'm bringing back the old staple lead belcher to do the chains around the helmet attached to the Squire. This section is actually surprisingly difficult because I have, basically a silver metallic chain around a silver metallic helm, and I want to make them look very different even though they're very small and are often seen from quite a ways away. It's for this reason that it's really nice to have a lot of different variation in your metallic paint, so if you have to do, say, like in this case, a silver on silver, you can use some different paints to make them more variated. So right now I'm going back to the face and doing a little bit of highlights with the Kislev flesh on top of the Cadian flesh tone before. Like I said before, the face of the Squire is not great. There's not a lot of good detail sculpted in it, so you really gotta be careful with the highlights here. I don't want to draw too much attention to the face, but I do want to make things not blend together completely, if that makes sense. It's a fine balance. But now that those final skin highlights are done, I'm just going to go through the various trinkets on this model, the leather, the chains, the helm, and just add a highlight to it. Pick these details out a little bit, and hopefully it'll distract from the model's naturally ugly face. Now, as you can probably tell, I don't have the hair painted on this model. I thought I recorded it. Apparently, I never started the video, so I don't have any recordings of me doing the hair. I generally do black hair the way Duncan Rhodes taught years ago. I do a layer of dark Reaper, a highlight of Thunderhawk Blue, and then I blend those colors together with Gnome Oil, and then maybe hit it with a final highlight of Rust Gray. I would stay away from black paints and even black contrast paints. The end result is too much of a true black, and it tends to look kind of cartoony rather than naturalistic. But besides the hair, the rest of the Squire is done, and now we only have the shield to paint. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the shield. Every method I am using here, I used elsewhere in the video. This is just really a victory lap. I am going to do the colors on the shield the same way I did the heraldry of the knight with the red and the blue. I am going to do the sword the same way I did the sword stuck in the banner, and then the chains I'm going to start with lead belcher and highlight them up a little bit the same way I've done elsewhere in the video before. But once this is done, we are basically just left with putting the model together and on its base, and then we get to enjoy how it turned out. So this is the knight in his finished state. Obviously, I spent a lot of time on this model. I couldn't even get the video, edited down that much. There's just so much details to do on this guy head to toe, but you have to be happy with how it turned out. The horse and knight have a nice balance of looking important, but not taking focus away from the banner, and the banner itself with the way it reflects light is just fantastic. I am incredibly pleased with how this model turned out, and if you somehow made it this far, I hope you enjoyed watching it. Thank you.